If you were creating a short list of luminaries in the field of public health, you wouldn't think that someone named Michelle Lujan Grisham would appear on that list. At no point in her life did Grisham receive any training in medicine or science. Instead, she has a Bachelor of Arts degree in something called university studies. And for the uninitiated, a degree in university studies is what people get when they don't want to study in a university. Then Grisham earned a law degree, which of course also has nothing to do with public health. And afterwards, for several years, Grisham worked at a State Department dealing with aging and long-term services. And she eventually directed that same department. Those were Michelle Lujan Grisham's credentials when in 2004, she became the highest-ranking public health official in the state of New Mexico. Presumably, the fact that she came from a prominent political family in the state didn't hurt her chances of getting the job. But whatever the case, Grisham's tenure as the state's Secretary of Health was unremarkable. She only had the post for a couple of years before moving on. But many years later, in 2020, the incoming Biden administration took a very close look at Michelle Lujan Grisham. For reasons that remain unknown, the Biden administration apparently believed that Grisham's limited experience in the field of public health from more than a decade ago qualified her to run the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level. This is the department that oversees all public health issues in the entire country. Biden's aides publicly courted her for the job. They said that she was under careful consideration. Ultimately, though, Grisham decided to remain as governor of New Mexico, so she didn't want the job. Now, in that capacity, from the beginning, Grisham has governed less like a politician and more like a public health bureaucrat with limitless power. For the past 3 years, Grisham has ruled the state under an indefinite public health emergency protocol. As recently as late last year, when most of the country had moved on from COVID, Grisham was issuing orders requiring that state workers and hospital employees wear masks and take a regular schedule of COVID shots. Grisham often cited experts like herself to justify these unlawful and increasingly untenable mandates. But by March of this year, the people of New Mexico finally had enough. Grisham, lacking the political will to sustain yet another extension of her public health powers, formally ended the COVID-19 emergency in the state. Now, it took long enough, but Grisham's authority to issue unilateral edicts was finally gone at that point. Now, put yourself in Michelle Lujan Grisham's position at that very moment. How would you handle the reality that you can no longer rule your state like a dictator? Now, if you're a well-adjusted person who cares about your constitutional oath of office, you'd probably be thankful that the emergency is over, even if it was fake to begin with. You wouldn't want to assert arbitrary extra-legal powers. Well, suffice it to say that that was not Michelle Grisham's reaction. Instead, she immediately began ruminating about other ways that she could expand her emergency powers. In May, in a conversation that didn't receive any attention from the media, Grisham spoke to Johns Hopkins University's School of Public Health about her plan to expand the field of quote-unquote public health to encompass everything. Every imaginable policy issue would fall under public health. And she announced this publicly. This is footage that should have set off a lot of alarm bells, but nobody even noticed it or talked about it. Here it is. Watch.
Everything is a public health issue. Gun violence is a public health issue. Poverty is a public health issue. Environmental consequences from energy is a public health issue. All of these disenfranchised populations, all of the equity barriers are all public health issues. And when we address those, our economy is better, our families are stronger, our risks are fewer. If we want to save the planet and we want to make families independent, we want to eradicate poverty and injustice, it's going to take a whole new class of young, dedicated professionals who are ready to take on the mantle. So I'm thrilled that they're watching and listening, and I'm ready to have you work in New Mexico. And there are many other states, including your own home states, who deserve you and need you. Let's go fix the world.
Everything is a public health issue, says Michelle Lujan Grisham. She says poverty, climate change, gun violence, all public health. Let's go fix the world, Grisham says, as the Johns Hopkins lady sitting there, public health lady, nods and grins along. Yes, let's fix the world. That's something we can do. Let's fix it. Now, you might be wondering when it became the goal of the public health industry to, quote, fix the world. Wasn't their gig supposed to be to, just to make sure the public is healthy? Public health, make sure the public is healthy? That's what I assumed. Not anymore, apparently. In fact, that hasn't been the goal since COVID. You might remember it was a Johns Hopkins public health expert, quote unquote, named Jennifer Nuzzo, who stated that it's a bad idea to riot during the COVID pandemic unless you're rioting for George Floyd and BLM, in which case go for it. So public health is not the goal anymore. Now the goal is to pursue social justice, which is what they mean when they talk about fixing the world. Now the goal is to correct every problem with the world, and the people who identify the problems are Governor Grisham and other left-wing bureaucrats like her. Now you can think of a variety of terms to describe what's going on here. Mission creep comes to mind. It's also incoherent because if every problem is a public health problem, then public health has outlived its usefulness as a distinct category because it's not a distinct category. If everything is a public health issue, then nothing is a public health issue. Whatever you call this phenomenon we're seeing, it's obvious what Grisham is doing and why she's doing it. Like the rest of the public health establishment, she has realized that she can assume totalitarian powers as long as she can claim that she's addressing some public health matter. The solution is to label everything a public health matter, and then she can do whatever she wants. And if she manages to get away with that, then she gets to control everything. That was her approach, and she said it out loud in front of a friendly audience back in May, not even trying to hide it. Well, it's clear that the left is giving up their morals and any common sense. There's no better time to build a habit of daily prayer and meditation. Building a habit of prayer can help you cultivate an attitude of gratitude. Focusing on what you are thankful for can increase positive emotions and improve overall well-being. Hallow is the #1 Christian prayer app in the U.S. It helped me maintain a daily prayer routine. It can help you do the same. Download the app for free at hallow.com/Matt Walsh. You can set prayer reminders and track your progress along the way. Not sure where to start? Well, check out Father Mike Schmitz's Bible in a Year podcast, available on the Hallow app. Or pray alongside Mark Wahlberg, Jim Caviezel, even some world-class athletes. With Hallow, you can customize a personal prayer plan that works for you. Listen wherever you are with downloadable offline sessions. Using Hallow to connect with others who share your beliefs and values can provide a sense of belonging, support, and foster a sense of community as well. Ultimately, we'll learn how we can become better individuals in spite of today's broken world as we strive to become more like Christ in our daily lives through prayer, fasting, and giving. Download Hallow at hallow.com/Matt Walsh. You get an exclusive 3 months free. That's 3 months absolutely free at hallow.com/Matt Walsh. A couple of days ago, as you may have seen, Grisham put the next stage of her plan into motion. She announced a public health order, quote unquote, that prohibits residents in so-called high crime areas, including New Mexico's biggest city, from possessing firearms outside of their homes. And in making this announcement, Grisham admits that criminals are not going to follow the law. Okay, the people that are actually committing the gun crime, they're not going to follow this. She admits that. She also acknowledges that she's probably going to get overturned in the courts because she doesn't really have the constitutional authority to do this. But she doesn't care. Watch.
But your point is valid.
You took an oath to the Constitution. Isn't it unconstitutional to say you cannot exercise your carry license?
With one exception, and that is if there's an emergency, and I've declared an emergency for a temporary amount of time, I can invoke additional powers. No constitutional right, in my view, including my oath, is intended to be absolute. There are restrictions on free speech. There are restrictions on my freedoms. In this emergency, this 11-year-old and all these parents who have lost all these children, they deserve my attention to have the debate about whether or not in an emergency we can create a safer environment. Because what about their constitutional rights? I took an oath to uphold those too. And if we ignore this growing problem without being bold, I've said to every other New Mexican, your rights are subrogated to theirs. And they are not, in my view.
Wait a minute. Okay. You're talking about crimes. There are already laws against the crimes, so how are their rights?
I got it. But again, if I'm unsafe, who's standing up for that right? If this climate is so out of control, somebody should do something. I'm doing as much as I know to do.
Madam Governor, do you really think that criminals are going to hear this message and not carry a gun in Albuquerque on the streets for 30 days?
No. But here's what I do think. It's a pretty resounding message.
Somebody should do something. Someone should do something, she says. That has been the justification for pretty much every tyrannical power grab in recent history. It's always under the guise of just do something. That was all of COVID, right? It was just do. It doesn't matter what we're doing. We're scared. So just do something. And she's doing something. Will it achieve anything at all? I mean, before we get to the question of whether she has the authority to do it, she doesn't. Will it even achieve anything? Even according to her. She seems skeptical of that. But she says that it sends a resounding message. She's not even pretending that there's any legal merit to this. She doesn't even suggest that criminals will obey it. It's all about the message. Well, what is that message exactly? Superficially, what Grisham is saying is that no right is absolute, in her words. And, that part of it, just isolated on its own, no right is absolute, that's basically true, of course. That's why there's a legal process for removing rights. If you are a convicted murderer, you lose your right to carry a gun, for example, and most people have no issue with that. Certainly everyone agrees that you can't bring your gun with you into prison. When you go into prison, you lose basically all of your constitutional rights, or most of them. And most people, again, have no issue with that. The problem is that Grisham is attempting to strip everyone's basic constitutional rights all at once by the stroke of a pen, basically treating everyone in the city like they are convicted murderers. And her reasoning to justify that dramatic expansion of her authority is ludicrous. I mean, there's always been gun crime. What exactly makes it a special emergency now? In that clip, you heard Grisham allude to something approaching an explanation, at least in her view. She says that an 11-year-old child was just shot and killed in a road rage incident near a baseball stadium in Albuquerque, which is a terrible travesty. Of course, someone shot 17 times at a moving vehicle, killing the child and critically injuring a woman inside the car. Therefore, Grisham says, because of this emotionally charged episode, we need to punish every law-abiding gun owner in the entire state, or at least in that city, and maybe eventually the entire state. We need to turn them all into criminals or treat them like they are. Now, if road rage is the issue, then you think that she would ban cars. I mean, you could say that, well, that never would have happened if not for guns. Never would have happened without cars. But I guess she doesn't think that she can get away with banning cars yet. So she's settling just for the guns. Interestingly enough, Grisham doesn't display any curiosity about the assailant in that shooting. At the moment that Grisham issued that order ending the Second Amendment in New Mexico because this 11-year-old was killed, authorities didn't know the identity of the suspect. They didn't know anything about it. They didn't know a single thing about him. And that's more than a little strange if you think about it. You have to wonder what kind of person shoots a moving vehicle 17 times due to road rage? Are we talking about a law-abiding a gun owner? Is that what we're talking about? It's possible. Or are we talking about somebody with a criminal history, perhaps? Maybe somebody on probation? Could it be that we're not even talking about an American citizen at all? Those are questions that Grisham very badly doesn't want you to think about, but they're reasonable questions, especially if you're familiar with the numbers on how many felons and illegal aliens are shooting up the streets of New Mexico right now. There's a lot of them. And thanks in large part to policies that Grisham and her fellow Democrats have enacted. Nearly half of all federal crimes in the entire country are committed in states like New Mexico that sit along the Mexican border. And there's a reason for that. It's not a coincidence. The reason is called open borders. But Democrats in the state haven't done anything about it. In fact, during the Trump administration, Grisham refused to call the border crisis an emergency. So that is not an emergency, but now the Second Amendment is an emergency. And it's not the criminals interstate who are shooting people. They're not the emergency. It's the Second Amendment itself. So where is this leading exactly? Again, Grisham knows her order is going to get overturned eventually, which is probably why she limits it to 30 days. She's hoping the courts will take longer than 30 days to strike this down. So what's the real agenda here? Is this order just a trial balloon to introduce this idea to the public so that down the line, these kinds of emergency orders are more palatable? Reading between the lines, you can see that the Democrat Party probably views it that way. Following Grisham's order, to the surprise of many conservatives, Democratic Senator Ted Lieu, along with the deeply neurotic anti-gun Harvard kid David Hogg, came out and actually criticized the order as unconstitutional. And they used almost precisely the same language, which tells you that a memo went out somewhere to coordinate left-wing messaging on this topic. So here's what Lou wrote, quote, "I support gun safety laws. However, no state in the union can suspend the federal Constitution. There is no such thing as a state public health emergency exception to the U.S. Constitution." Hogg wrote basically the same thing, quote, "I support gun safety, but there is no such thing as a state public health emergency exception to the U.S. Constitution." Now, first of all, notice how creepy it is that a Harvard brat and a U.S. senator are sourcing their talking points from the same mysterious higher power. And we know that these are talking points. They're saying exactly the same thing. Those posts did not come from Ted Lieu's office or the brilliant mind of David Hogg. They probably came from the DNC, which is providing messaging on how to handle this. And for that reason, it's worth parsing the messages very carefully. Both messages say that there's no state exception to the U.S. Constitution that allows for public health emergencies to supersede constitutional rights. And that sounds good, but of course it doesn't go far enough, not even close. There's a reason they say state, because they're deliberately leaving open the possibility that the federal government might be able to step in and create such public health exemptions to constitutional rights. They're reserving that power for Congress at some point in the future, even as they say that states can't do it on their own. And that's a big deal because if you think back to COVID, some of the biggest infringements on civil liberties came from the federal government's assertion of emergency powers. The CDC, we all forget, nationalized the country's rental properties. Unilaterally, on their own, they did this. They made it illegal for landlords to evict tenants, even if the tenants weren't paying rent. Nothing like that has ever happened in this country before, but a so-called public health agency did it on their own. And of course, the Biden administration fired service members who didn't take the shot. In fact, they tried to have more than 100 million workers in private companies fired unless they took the shot or submitted to regular COVID testing over and over again. The Fed set the blueprint for COVID totalitarianism and the states followed. So is that what they're planning for the next emergency, quote unquote? Will the federal government attempt to use emergency powers to supersede the Second Amendment as they superseded all of our rights during COVID? Now, for the moment, thankfully, it doesn't appear that this attempt to unilaterally end the Second Amendment in New Mexico will succeed. For one thing, several law enforcement officials in New Mexico have already come out and said that they're not going to enforce the order. And yesterday, as journalist Ford Fisher documented, protesters, many of them openly carrying, showed up in Albuquerque and the police didn't do anything about it. And on one hand, this is obviously encouraging. It shows why we have the Second Amendment in the first place. It's a self-reinforcing amendment, essentially. When everybody's armed, it's awfully difficult for police to disarm everyone without violence, and that's violence that no politician wants to be responsible for, at least not yet. But at the same time, this is all still profoundly distressing. It shouldn't fall on American citizens to go out in public and risk arrest or civil penalties or worse to enjoy a constitutional right. The simple fact that this kind of demonstration is even necessary is a huge win for the left. This is a win for the partisans who want to chip away at our constitutional rights bit by bit until they're gone. And we know that because Grisham, the governor, should be in prison right now. She is conspiring to undermine the federal rights of American citizens, which, according to the precedent set by the Trump prosecutions, is supposed to be a very serious crime. And unlike Trump, Grisham is openly admitting that she intends to subvert Americans' constitutional rights. She's admitting it. In fact, as of last night, Grisham was openly bragging about all this on Twitter. So why isn't every DA in New Mexico bringing charges against Grisham tonight? Why aren't where are the RICO charges? Where are the raids on her mansion? Why isn't she being frog marched down the street in handcuffs? Why aren't they trying to throw her in prison for the rest of her life? That's what she deserves. It's what the left would obviously do if the shoe was on the other foot. Imagine if a Republican governor tried to, unilaterally suspend the 19th Amendment, arguing that women voters are a threat to the country and our way of life. How do we think Democrats would respond to that? No, they'd be saying, bring the federal government and put that person in jail right now. Remove them from power today because of that. That's not what's happening to Grisham. So if this order was a trial balloon, the response from the right has been woefully insufficient. Tyrants have always used emergencies, whether real or imaginary, to justify their power grabs. COVID was the pivotal moment when most of the country laid down and allowed the government to suspend essentially all of our rights for the sake of protecting us against a cold. Career bureaucrats like Governor Grisham, they took note of that. And now she's taking it to the next level. And she's getting really only minimal pushback. It's not hard to imagine where this goes next. As we showed you in that video from Johns Hopkins, Grisham herself has already outlined the plan from here. So we can probably expect a climate change emergency to justify banning cars, a transphobia emergency to shut down non-affirming speech, a racism emergency to ram through a federal reparations plan, a poverty emergency to redistribute wealth. The possibilities are endless. And unless public health autocrats like Michelle Lujan Grisham experience real consequences for what they're doing, then these nation-ending possibilities will become reality. Thanks for checking out this video. If you'd like to listen to my full podcast on the go, you can check out The Matt Walsh Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.